With the Overwatch 2 beta around the corner, I want to get down some early predictions on how I think the game is going to change from now in 6v6 to the game finally launching fully. Obviously these are just some fun predictions, but hopefully it should inspire some good thinking. The biggest change is going to be 5v5, so we'll start there. The main thing to realise is that we aren't just losing a random player, we're losing a tank, which in short basically means the death of the anchor. One of the most common positions tanks find themselves in is when they're holding a corner or doorway to anchor that position in a way that makes it difficult for the enemy to push around without committing major resources. Tanks are uniquely suited to playing as anchors, since they have close range threat versus enemies coming round, their kits have damage mitigation through things like shield or matrix, and most importantly, have large enough health pools to actually make use of the high healing potential of the supports. And I really want to stress that last bit, that their shields or matrix plus their high health pools allow them to take a bunch of enemy pressure by themselves for the few crucial seconds it takes their team to react to the fact that they're taking that pressure. This means things like Ryan safely being able to take spam damage from main, even from things like Hanzo headshots, and being able to survive and shield himself until he gets healed. Or a thing like D.Va or Sig holding an angle, then getting pressured by enemy DPS, but holding their own for the time it takes the team to shift their attention to helping that skirmish. The team can help that skirmish by shifting healing and damage resources into that area and fighting for it, or by counter-rotating on the other side of the map, depending on what their setup is. The important factor here is time. For someone to get healed, even if they're standing in main, takes time. For the team to recognize there's a skirmish on an angle, then shift their attention to help in that area, takes time. Tanks being able to negate some damage and use their health pools to tank the rest is what buys their team time to react to those developments. Sometimes we're talking about fractions of a second for heals and main, and sometimes we're talking about several seconds for the flank rotations. But without the tanks using their kits to buy time for those things, they cannot happen. Losing one of the two heroes that can consistently trade their kit versus enemy pressure to buy their team time has a lot of effect on the default playstyle, but we'll start by looking at the anchor. So we have this traditional idea of the anchor where they're holding a corner, they have heals and cleave versus any enemies brawling on that corner, as well as the threat of trading onto the enemy backline if enemies try and run straight past them. The amount of presence that anchors have in these positions is one of the main things that controls the tempo of the game. In 6v6, we usually deal with anchors either by bursting round with a load of ultimates and clearing them, or more likely by finding an angle onto that anchor. Since the tanks themselves don't have great range pressure, an off angle can easily dislodge them from their position, which is basically the fundamental way to break chokes. That angle can also be used to pressure the backline and distract them from healing the anchor, which does pretty much the same thing, especially when combined with a push from main. In 6v6, anchors rely on their team to contest the angles that would otherwise dislodge them. DPS can do this contesting role, but typically it's by setting up their own angle onto the enemy team and drawing resources away from the anchor that way, since there's no point anchoring a position if your team isn't already in, or at least working towards, a positional advantage. You know there's no point forcing a brawl in a corner if your DPS have terrible angles onto that corner. The other issue DPS have, we've already mentioned, that they don't have the kit or health pools to sustain themselves for long enough during a skirmish for their team to react and help. We can imagine a less mobile DPS like Ashe or Cassidy holding an angle. If they suddenly get pressured by 2 or even 3 enemies, they'll get immediately killed or pushed out before the healers can react. And even if the supports are right on top of them, they still run the risk of being one-shot. In 6v6, typically there's a tank like Sig or D.Va in position to help these players, by holding the angle with them or by flying over with Matrix to keep them alive, again for that crucial time it takes the team to respond, either by supporting them or by pushing elsewhere, which again is often the second role of the anchor. So DPS can kinda do this job of contesting angles, but it's much more important for them to set up their own, and for most DPS to contest these positions, they often still need the support of a tank. So that overall role of stopping the enemy getting an angle onto the anchor is typically the role of the off-tank, both to contest and buy time to react on the flank as we mentioned, as well as helping the brawl in main if the enemy burst round or put on heavy spam. But in 5v5, this second tank just doesn't exist, so we can't stop the anchor getting burst from main, can't help range DPS do their playstyle of peeking an angle then escaping once the enemy respond, and can't stop the enemy getting angles onto the anchor or onto the supports. So in short, there's no real way to safely anchor corners for any sustained period of time, and this completely changes the flow of the game. No longer can our supports set up where they're protected from main by an anchor and by a DPS angle on one side, with an off-tank able to buy them time to react to supporting whichever area takes the most pressure. In 6v6, this is more or less the default setup for a lot of team comms, and one of its main uses is to make sure enemies can't just engage directly onto your backline. They've actually got to fight past or rotate around some teammates first. And we do see this with almost every comp. But without a second tank, we just can't set up that type of fight. First, this really screws over support positioning, since we don't have an anchor contesting main, and our DPS aren't able to cover all the angles, so it's incredibly easy to stage a dive onto the supports. Enemies can just run up and engage through main, or flank without as much risk of getting contested. We've seen a lot of players say that early Overwatch 2 isn't great for supports, and this is pretty much why. This vulnerability is also going to force the tank to focus on keeping that backline alive. Here we'll probably see a very similar role to off-tank in the dive comps, where we see trios of D.Va Brig Zen or Zarya Brig Ana forcing rotations around the map to get into better positions. They have enough sustain to cross open spaces and enough brawl potential to fight any flankers they run into. In 6v6, the off-tank does want to split from them to make their own angle whenever they get the opportunity, but that's usually when the team has gotten into that default setup with the anchor, and so the supports are fairly safe. In 5v5, without that default setup, it's going to be hard to find chances to split from the supports, so we'll probably see them running around as a constant trio quite a lot in the early metas. These changes also heavily limit the traditional role of ranged DPS like Ashe or Cassidy. If that DPS splits early to try and get an angle, it's very easy to stage for them and kill them, since we just don't have that setup that gives supports and off-tanks the freedom to fully focus on helping them. And without an anchor in main, even if they do get that position, there's not really going to be anything to shoot. There's basically no reason for the enemy to be in main without their own anchor, and so we're almost never going to be in that situation where the anchor can force a brawl in main for the DPS to get their angle on. And if that DPS drags their solo tank and supports with them so they don't get insta-killed when they take the angle, then it's not really an angle anymore, since the enemy team can easily rotate around them and take advantage of them being clumped up. This isn't to say that ranged DPS are totally bad, just that all those mid-masters Ashe players who can only spam down main are probably going to suffer. So we've got a few different ideas here. It's easy to engage onto supports, it's difficult to split as off-tank, and it's difficult to split as ranged DPS. But what does this actually mean in terms of comps and playstyles? I think that first, to keep their backline alive, we'll probably see teams use the Brig Zen dive comp as a template, but obviously without the Wrecking Ball. So we'd have a core of Brig Zen D.Va, sometimes with a DPS like Cassidy, who hard rotate around the map, clearing flankers by brawling them and forcing enemies to hide by shooting them, to get into a strong position with LOS either on the objective while their flankers force it, or onto the enemy backline while their flankers dive it. Again, fairly similar to the current Brig Zen in 6v6, so lots of rotations and counter-rotations, lots of tracers dueling around cart, lots of hard pushes onto the enemy backline whenever you have the ult advantage. It's a pretty familiar playstyle from 6v6, but I don't think it'll actually work that well. I think the supports will still be too vulnerable to solo flanks, and even if the core does a good job of denying those flankers when they engage, all that attention on the flanks will leave the rest of the enemy too free to take all the good positions. Remember too, the divers have a huge amount of freedom in staging areas now that there's no anchor, and that any ranged DPS is going to struggle to split and contest the flankers early, so it should be fairly easy to get into a position where a straight engage, especially if it's with Zarya bubbles or ults like Nano, should be able to power through. Those Zarya and Nano swaps are pretty great too, since they can peel for themselves much better versus hard engages and even pulse bombs due to nade and bubble. Those nades and bubbles are also one of the only ways to let a tank anchor a position for a short period of time, which again is always going to be useful. And of course, Nano is incredible for saving teammates, helping teammates win duels, or alongside a bubble, ensuring your tracer can hard engage and kill the enemy supports. Again, this would just be a response to how easy it is to stage for supports. But I don't want to get bogged down in hero picks, since I don't actually know anything about the hero changes. The main takeaway is that there's going to be a huge amount of ways to engage onto enemy supports. The easy response to that is playing the slower playstyle break comps and rotating from cover to cover, but even that isn't going to be good enough if the enemy can concentrate their resources into an engage. However, there is a perfect counter to that type of engage, and it's just not being there. And I am being serious here. If you're not able to disrupt the enemy engage by starting the fight yourself, you gotta find a way to reposition. For this, I genuinely think we might see the return of Lucio. Those Briggs End rotations to clear the flanks work great in 6v6, but that's with an anchor, and yes, Hammond does act as an anchor in those comps, slowing down the pace at which enemies move into the space you're leaving behind you, as well as being a threat if the enemy contests your rotation. In 5v5, we don't have that, so I feel like there are going to be plenty of ways to catch those types of rotations out. But if we instead use a speed boost to quickly change our positions whenever the enemy is trying to stage, it's going to be tough for them to get an effective dive, both because we can really scare away those flankers ahead of us, and also outrun any enemies trying to get behind us. Combine that with an Ana and probably a D.Va, and you've got a great core to rotate around, dodging dives and fighting flankers with. Have your own Tracer play sneaky and stick a mobile range DPS in the mix, probably something like Sojourn, assuming her kit has vertical mobility, and you have a really adaptable comp that can do some super funky rotations to disrupt enemy setups, as well as use their backline's great stabilization potential to survive versus enemy engages they get through, plus obviously abuse D.Va's efficiency as a nano battery. I've got no idea if this would actually work, and that second DPS could also be something like Reaper making use of TPs, but I really like that type of playstyle where we focus on keeping our backline moving as a reaction to being unable to anchor or contest the staging areas as we do in 6v6. So the main thing for me really is the death of the anchor, which takes away the entire default setup for almost every comp. I'm super keen to hear your ideas on this, especially the spicy takes, so write some stuff in the comments or in the Discord. Thanks for watching, and I'm also writing another video on balance predictions, so I'll try and get that one out soon.